Hey, well, it's a real privilege to be with everybody. I think, is this on already? Can you hear me? Okay. Great to see so many old friends and to have the occasion to talk with you. I know it's obviously a very desperate situation in Afghanistan. It's been heartbreaking for all of you, I know. Heartbreaking for all of us who had the great privilege of getting to know you and the Afghan people over many years. I think it's important, and I don't want to go too far back in time, but I think what we have not done is really tried to understand fully the causes of the profound failure in Afghanistan, and the causes of the hell, I think, that into which Afghanistan has descended after the collapse of security in August of 2021 and in the months prior to that. So I'd like to just offer a few remarks on that, and then maybe we'll have a conversation more about what's happening today and what can be done in the future. But I had felt over many years that we had not taken a long-term and reasoned approach to the conflict in Afghanistan. And instead, we had taken essentially a short-term approach to what was a long-term problem there. Of course, in a country, as all of you know far better than I do, have been ravaged by decades of conflict, that have been under tremendous strain, and a country in which the institutions of governance that we would kind of anticipate and expect had been systematically dismantled or turned against their very purpose by the Taliban regime after the destructive civil war and the Taliban's grip on power from '96 to 2001. And what happened, I believe, in the operations in 2001 was a very successful operation to collapse the Taliban government and collapse the military forces of the Taliban. But where the failure came in was a lack of understanding about what it would take to consolidate military gains and get to a sustainable political outcome in Afghanistan, under which the country could gradually strengthen and regain its prosperity and be able to lessen its reliance on the international community and prevent a return from jihadist terrorists who had caused so much suffering and hardship in Afghanistan. And part of the reason for that, I believe, goes back to the Vietnam War and the wrong lessons of the Vietnam War and the wrong lessons of the lopsided U.S. victory over Saddam Hussein in 1991. And I'll try to explain this very quickly. But after Vietnam, what dominated the U.S. approach to foreign policy was what some people called the Vietnam syndrome. And that was the idea that any kind of protracted commitment abroad was going to be fundamentally too difficult for the United States to persevere through. And so what we really needed to do, if we had any kind of military interventions, was for those interventions to be quick and the exit after that intervention to be quick as well. Of course, this ignored, I think, the reality that it has never been an optional phase in war to just leave after a military operation without consolidating those gains and getting to a sustainable political outcome. This is what my colleague on the NSC staff, Nadia Shadlow, called in a book, War and the Art of Governance, which has a chapter on interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, American Denial Syndrome. That idea of not having to consolidate political gains and to engage in institution or any kind of state-building efforts was reinforced by the rapid victory in the Gulf War, based on a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, of the nature of that war. That was a war that appeared easy because the Iraqi army fought us symmetrically and we had overmatch, but also it appeared easy because we had a very narrowly circumscribed political objective, which really was just to return Kuwait to the Kuwaitis. And after witnessing the lopsided military victory over the fourth largest army in the world, there grew into the American military lexicon this idea of a revolution in military affairs. And what that revolution in military affairs would deliver would be fast, quick, deep, and efficient victories over enemies in the future. This is what drove, in large measure, the light footprint approach in Afghanistan in 2001 and into 2002, when the U.S. Special Forces, U.S. intelligence, and U.S. air power enabled Mujahideen-era militias in their effort to defeat the forces of the Taliban and unseat the government. But of course, this force and this level of effort proved to be inadequate to build state institutions and functions after the collapse of the Taliban. And it had super empowered militias that, because of the lack of state building effort, were essentially able to morph into criminalized patronage networks and effect state capture over state institutions and functions from the ground up. And sadly, those forces actually began to pursue their own agendas, which were criminal agendas to a certain extent, but mainly agendas to consolidate power in advance of a post-US and a post-international community Afghanistan. And we reinforced that predilection among these groups by telling everybody we were leaving. And so when President Karzai at the time in the early 2000s looked over his shoulder in terms of who has his back, we said we were leaving. This is remember the mission accomplished speech that many people focus on about Iraq from the aircraft carrier. This is the image of President Bush in front of the big banner. Many people forget that at the same time Secretary Rumsfeld was in Afghanistan, announcing a significant reduction of U.S. forces and the end of combat operations there as well. Of course, we all know that was premature. And I think it was at this time, really in the 2003, 2004, 2005 period, when the political settlement in Afghanistan became reliant essentially on unchecked criminality. And in exchange for impunity, these groups would give their political fealty to the existing political order. And so years later, when I had the opportunity to form a counter-corruption organized crime task force in Afghanistan and work with some of the leaders in this room, it was quite clear to me that these groups, these criminalized patronage networks, had become stakeholders in state weakness, because it was the weakness of state institutions that gave them freedom of action and impunity. And of course, at the same time, we were engaging in a range of strategies on the U.S. side and the international side that didn't make sense given the reality on the ground in Afghanistan. And what I'm talking about in particular is the construct of the Obama administration that really the Taliban wasn't the issue. It was really only al-Qaeda. And this is when we began to engage in this delusion that there's a bold line between the Taliban and other terrorist organizations, a delusion that some people very senior in our intelligence agency still hold today. We engaged in other delusions as well, I think, in this period of time. One of them was that Pakistan, if offered sustained military and economic assistance, would join us in an effort to counter the Taliban rather than continue their effort with the ISI to build their capabilities, as well as the capabilities of other jihadist terrorist organizations, which they use as an arm of their foreign policy. So it was self-delusion, I would say, and inadequate efforts. We also know that after 2008, 9, and the Bush administration's recognition that the short-term approach to a long-term problem in Afghanistan was lengthening the war and making the war more costly, became over-enthusiastic about much of the aid that was delivered, and delivered a lot of economic assistance and development assistance far beyond the absorptive capacity of the Afghan state, which created a boon for these criminalized criminalized patronage networks, as well as the Taliban and terrorist organizations that were in control of territory where a lot of this money was flowing. So we were essentially, we could have cut out the middleman essentially and just written checks directly to the Taliban in this period of time. So this is the situation I was aware of, and this is my understanding of the war. It's a very brief description. Of course, there's much more detail. When I took the job as National Security Advisor unexpectedly in 2017. And I realized that now I was responsible for helping a new president devise a strategy and approach to South Asia and to Afghanistan. And I believe in 2017, President Trump announced and we began to implement the first reasoned, sustainable, long-term approach to the war in Afghanistan and the problem set in South Asia, including Pakistan's support for jihadist terrorists and the Taliban that had existed since 2001. Sadly, I watched, having left that job, the president abandon that strategy and resurrect a lot of the fundamental flaws of previous strategies, including an announced timeline for withdrawal, and then after announcing your withdrawal, to engage with the Taliban and somehow hope for a favorable negotiated settlement. What was most disconcerting to me in this period of time, in 2019 and into 2020, was the decision to engage the Taliban in negotiations without the presence of the Afghan government, which delegitimized the Afghan government, I think, and then take a series of actions which I could only interpret really as partnering with the Taliban against the Afghan government, including listing, all the things that we wouldn't do. We stopped targeting actively the Taliban. We reduced, not only the active targeting of the Taliban, but intelligence and air support for Afghan security forces. We again announced the timeline for the withdrawal, and then we forced the Afghan government to release 5,000 of some of the most heinous criminals on earth during this period of time. So, I when I think back on this, and I was a big critic of the Obama administration's strategy and policy toward Iraq, and the precipitous withdrawal, I think in 2010, that led to Al Qaeda coming back in the form of ISIS and becoming the most destructive terrorist organization in history. But at least the Obama administration didn't negotiate with Al Qaeda on the way out of Iraq. So I think that I would regard the situation in Afghanistan and the collapse of security as a self-defeat based on self-delusion and the stories people told themselves to justify a fundamentally flawed strategy. And we all know what these myths are, right? That the Taliban is sort of just this romantic movement that is somehow compatible with the long history and culture of Afghanistan, rather than the creation of Salafi jihadists that can go back, I think, to the Mujahideen era resistance to the Soviet occupation, but was sustained by Gulf donors and sustained by Pakistan's ISI, trained and equipped as a transnational terrorist organization. The myth also, that there was a bold line between the Taliban and other jihadist terrorist organizations, when we know for certain they share people, they share resources and know-how and so forth. They are sometimes at odds with other terrorist organizations, like ISIS-K, but they often cooperate, as I believe they did in August of 2021, to murder Afghans and murder 13 American servicemen and women during the evacuation. Also, I think we engaged in the self-delusion that Pakistan could play a more productive role. All of these were assumptions that we had questioned when I was National Security Advisor, and that we had invalidated. And the invalidation of those assumptions became the basis for that strategy. For reasons I don't fully understand, President Trump then resurrected those elements of self-delusion, which became the basis, I think, for the self-defeat of the negotiated settlement, what I would call a surrender agreement, in February of 2020, executed faithfully by the Biden administration, who didn't really feel bound to execute any other Trump policies, but used the excuse that it had to follow through on that. So, it's heartbreaking for me. I think that everything that has happened since then in Afghanistan was absolutely predictable, in terms of the nature of the Taliban regime, the repression that it has been engaged in, the relationship with terrorist organizations, with now safe havens or support bases or training bases in about 15 provinces. And I'm afraid, no hope for success in the near term, except among those of you here who should do everything. We should do everything we can to amplify your voices and to call for anything that we can do to weaken the Taliban regime and strengthen the Afghan people, and to ensure that we don't engage in self-destructive behavior, such as the delivery of assistance through the Taliban, which we know they would only co-opt to strengthen their control and to victimize even more people on a larger scale. So, it's not a happy message that I'm giving you. Maybe it's a bit of therapy for me to be with you to talk about my understanding of how we got to where we are today. But it's a privilege to be with you for this conference, and I'd love to hear where you'd like to take the discussion.
Thank you, General. Thank you so much. General McMaster, it's truly an honor to have you with us on the stage of AFON, an Institute for Strategic Studies, such a long name. And my community. Can you get the mic closer? Yes, mic is always an issue. So my community and I truly admire you and your leadership and your support toward our community and the country of our birth. Before we start, I should say Dr. Moradian did a great job with choosing me leading this conversation for two reasons. One, I have this special interest and respect to people with military background. And second, I heard you have this special interest in my home city, the city of my birth, Herat, which my accent will take you to that city today. So today we are going to talk about some easy topic like, political trend, Afghanistan collapse, democracy, stuff like that. But before we get there, if you don't mind, let's start with you. So, in general, I understand you have this extraordinary background in military leadership. You had a major role in Operation Enduring Freedom, in Operation Iraqi Freedom, in Islamic State. You taught military at university, still you do, and you come from a military family. So I like to know, I mean, how do you think about the current stage of American forces on global stage, on global crisis, and carrying global crisis? Or in another word, how do you see American shows up on global stages militarily?
Well, I think that we still, as I mentioned, have not come to grips with the real lessons of the failure in Afghanistan. And as a result, we have actually engaged in kind of an emotional cathartic, I think, to focus on other kinds of conflict and to define future war as fundamentally different from the experiences that we've had in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Much like the Vietnam syndrome that I described earlier, I think now what is envisioned largely in the Department of Defense is a high tech war against the People's Republic of China and the People's Liberation Army of China, or a great power clash with China, or maybe with Iran, or maybe with Russia and so forth. That kind of reduces war to kind of more of a targeting exercise, or or standoff kind of range engagements with long range precision weapons. But I think what the war in Europe, in Ukraine, and the war in the Middle East, centered on Gaza and now Lebanon and the West Bank, and I think what that shows is that really war is waged for control of people and territory and resources, and the war is profoundly human. It's a human endeavor. And if you don't understand the political dynamics, the human dynamics, and have forces that can operate as part of multinational teams and interdepartmental teams and integrate what you're doing militarily with what you're trying to achieve politically and diplomatically, you're never really going to be able to succeed in war. And I think this lesson is kind of lost, and I think the Afghan experience is understood only superficially through like some of these overarching terms like nation building, which is a dirty word now, or democracy promotion, which is a dirty word. And I think what the reflexive, opposition to institution building or state building or democracy promotion, I think is uninformed by understanding or getting to know the people of Afghanistan, for example, or the people in this case, today who are seeing their freedom extinguished in Venezuela, or pick an authoritarian regime. And so I think a lot of Americans these days think that we have engaged in kind of an arrogant practice of trying to establish kind of Jeffersonian democracy in cultures that are not predisposed toward that. But I think what that kind of a superficial understanding is based in what I might call like bigotry masquerading as cultural sensitivity, and the belief that certain peoples don't really want representative government. They don't really want rule of law. They don't want equal rights under the law or freedom of speech. And I don't believe that. I don't think that there are any peoples who are culturally or genetically predisposed toward not wanting a say in how they're governed. So I think what is really important is to amplify your voices. I mean, I think if more Americans knew Afghans, we would never have had the disastrous kind of pullout we had in Afghanistan. Because the dominant narrative here in the United States was all about, the Taliban of terrorist attacks, the casualties, the drumbeat of violence. There were really no stories about the fundamental shifts that had occurred in Afghanistan, the great achievements that had occurred in the area of education or healthcare or freedom of speech or representative government, any of that, right? So I just think that in many ways, the failure of will, which really what it was in Afghanistan, was related to a lack of knowledge of the Afghan people and the experience of the Afghan people.
Well, thank you, General. I mean, we come to Afghanistan, but before that, back to your military background. General, I understand you led a lot of major operation, including Shafafiyat Task Force with ISAF in Afghanistan. And also you spent a lot of time at our embassy working with our diplomat and seeing how hard our diplomats are working for the aim. You were there. So, and I have all these veteran friends coming from Afghanistan. And when I talk to them, they have these moment of their life experience where they realize it cannot be only military doing serving our national interests and also bringing freedom to other society where we go there. So tell us what's your moment?
Yeah. Well, I think the real moment is the recognition that you have to put, in this case, the Afghan people at the center of your effort and try to understand the social, cultural, but mainly the political dynamics associated with, the war effort or the effort to build more resilient and effective governance. And I think what happened and what I noticed, in Afghanistan, really when I visited there multiple times in 2003 to 2004, and then when I returned from 2010 to 2012, is that there weren't enough people talking to Afghans. And I remember going to see Dr. Spanta and Dawood very early in my time there. I mean, I broke all regulations in a number of ways to get to know a lot of Afghans, drinking my Herati tea on occasion, or going to Herat and meeting, kind of the extended family in Herat, General Azimi and his family, and so many other wonderful people. Whose son, of course, made the ultimate sacrifice in the waning months of the war. And so what I would do is just listen. I think that's what you have to do is just listen. And what I learned is really how the problem of corruption, organized crime, for example, which was our task force, was fundamentally an issue of political will. And so I think that that's kind of one of the big lessons is you have to listen and you have to understand the political dynamics. In our embassies, there was a lot of hard work going on, but a lot of what happens in embassies is the running of programs. And those programs are really judged to be effective or ineffective based on sometimes just how many resources they burn through in the execution of the program. I mean, there was a word for it. It was called the burn rate for aid, for example. There oftentimes are measures of performance in terms of how many classes were held or, how many, counter-corruption, measures were put in place. But there were very rarely measures of effectiveness in really trying to understand the degree to which any of these programs were relevant, to the actual problem set. And so what we determined quite early on is that unless you address the issue of political will and you work with Afghans to generate the incentives necessary for the real reform, such that in this case, for example, corruption and organized crime was no longer a fatal threat to the state, right? We didn't think that Afghanistan would immediately be transformed into Denmark, right, in terms of transparency and accountability standards. But, I didn't think Afghanistan needed to be Denmark. Afghanistan just needed to be Afghanistan, and with a level of this kind of corruption and organized crime such it was no longer fatal to the Afghan state, that the state could generate the revenue, it could develop the strength and its security forces necessary to withstand the continued assault and the growing assault from from the Taliban and their terrorist and Pakistani sponsors, for example.
Oh, exactly. And a last question, and then we open it up to the audience for a question. So a lot of women in this room, including myself and those who are watching us online or will watch us later, are those women who have seen American goodwill in Afghanistan. I mean, those American souls in Afghanistan who were there to create a better life for Afghan. And many of these women still are looking at American leader to fulfill their promises. What's your message to these women?
Well, I think that what we have to do is make the case, right? Because you will get the level of commitment to Afghanistan that the American people are willing to support. And so I think the primary role for all of us now is education, I think. As you know, that there's not much information coming out of Afghanistan. There are from certain Afghan networks and news media. But I think that we have to amplify that voice to get it more out through mainstream America press, partnerships maybe with American networks. I think any kind of documentaries and any voice that we have, we should use to explain it, because really, again, in the U.S. too, it's an issue of will. But for all of us who are engaged in this project together, from this fraught, difficult, project since 2001, I would say that, for American soldiers, servicemen and women who served in Afghanistan, what I often say to them is, if you want evidence of the nobility of your mission, if you want evidence of why the sacrifices that were made and the hardships that were endured were worth it, look at Afghanistan while the U.S. was still engaged, and look at Afghanistan after we disengaged. And so I think this is one way that I try to help people deal with not anything like the trauma that you and your families have engaged as Afghans, but the trauma of those who saw their people who they loved give their lives in a cause that then they saw it was not completed, right? A mission that was not completed. So I think that for those in sort of the various wings of the U.S. media who portrayed the Taliban as a benign organization, right? The New Yorker article that said women in southern Afghanistan are far better off under the Taliban than they were when America was engaged there, or certain professors from Columbia University, who portrayed this organization as an organization that disconnected from jihadist terrorist organizations, and still are in denial about it, even after Zawahi was killed in the Minister of Interior's house, in Sherpur. So I think I think those people should have been exposed too, but I don't hear any of them apologizing either. So I think that we have a lot of work to do to educate. Not for to embarrass those who were apologists for the Taliban for so long, but for us to educate Americans and others so that we can sustain our commitment and grow our commitment to the Afghan people, and remain resolved to not do a damn thing, nothing that can strengthen the Taliban. I mean, I think that this idea that we can deliver assistance to them and somehow it will get to the Afghan people without being corrupted and turned to their misogynistic and repressive purposes, I think is continued self-delusion.
Well, thank you, General. So let's take some questions because as we are running out of time. Oh my God, a lot of hands. So let's start with Ambassador Jawad.
Thank you very much, Said Jawad with American University of Afghanistan. General, you've been a long-standing friend. There is tremendous amount of respect for you for what you did in Afghanistan, especially actually your efforts under Shafafiyat and other to fight corruption and create resiliency in among Afghan institutions. This is your friend, myself, and many others share this. We are very grateful. Your personal passion and commitment is evident when you talk about Afghanistan, and thank you for the good works about Afghanistan. And I know a lot of my friends have read your book. Those who have not read it, I really recommend to read his book, At War with Ourselves. General, the Doha Agreement, for me as a student of diplomacy, was the worst agreement that U.S. ever negotiated. With all due respect to Dr. Espanto, so we are diplomats. We carry a message, we make mistakes, so what? My question is about the attachment to the Doha Agreement, which actually lay out how the intelligence cooperation with Taliban be carried out to fight Al-Qaeda, the details of intelligence sharing operation, etc. With the presence of almost every intelligence institution of the United States in Afghanistan, and the military presence, why would people drink this Kool-Aid? Why they would believe in this? What happened? Where was the failure? Thank you.
This is confounding to me too. I think a lot of it has to do with the degree to which intelligence organizations can become biased based on policy preference. And it was clear that in the Obama administration, there had been the Rydell report that was actually a very sound report, a review of Afghan policy delivered to President Obama in 2009. That report was largely discarded by the Obama administration to create a spin, like a communication strategy about Afghanistan. And part of that communication strategy about Afghanistan was that the Taliban was completely separate from Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. This was reinforced by Vice President Biden at the time, who found this a convenient construct because he had been insulted by President Karzai when he visited, even before the inauguration. This is in December of 2008. Do you remember he walked out of the dinner? And so he always had a chip on his shoulder, and he's a very stubborn person, President Biden. And I think he carried that with him even into his time as president. And that's one of the reasons why he said, hey, here's the date you get out by, and here's the number of troops. I don't want to hear from anybody anything different. So I think because the policy preference was because it was a very performative administration in the Obama administration, I think in many ways they valued the performance and what they said publicly much higher than what they actually did or achieved from a policy perspective. What fit their narrative, their preference, was this difference between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, that they were somehow pitted against each other in complete ignorance of, or ignoring, not ignorance, really ignoring the fact that the Taliban regenerated, with the help of Al-Qaeda and with the help of the ISI after 2001. So I tell the story in the book At War with Ourselves. It's a real page turner, I got to tell you. No, I'm just joking. One of the painful parts of the book to write about was Afghanistan. There's a lot in the book of Afghanistan. My editor maybe cut I had probably 3 times more. And he said, this whole book's about Afghanistan. I said, well, so there's a lot more that I had written about it. But I tell the story of when we're trying to frame and initiate an Afghan policy review soon after I took over as National Security Advisor. And I got the paper from our intelligence community, and I wrote across the top of it in bold Sharpie, did we outsource this paper to the Taliban? I mean, I thought it read like it was written by the Taliban. And so I think that a lot of it had to do with this kind of policy preference. There's an old essay, I think back from the late 1960s. It was written by the first head of INR, which is the State Department's intel arm. And it's a 1960s paper. So the title is The Fate of Facts in the Lives of Men. That should be men and women, obviously. But basically the argument in the paper is the intelligence community has to guard against writing intelligence in a way that's biased toward the policymaker's preference. And I think that's what happened.
So let's take 2 more questions and then we respond together. Oh, I'm a gender justice person, so if there is a woman, so we take women questions. If not, we go to men. Oh, Sahra, go ahead, Sahra. Sorry, guys, I'm a gender justice person.
Hi, my name is Sahra Karimi. I am a filmmaker and also professor of film study at Yale University. So my question is that, okay, you were kind of national security advisor to President Trump, but we know that the decision to leave made by President Obama and then President Trump and then President Biden. So what is the role of those advisors in general
Mhm.
when they are advising?
Thank you, Sahra. Thank you.
Yeah.
So let's take one.
I didn't ask.
Sorry.
Still.
Until you're done.
Okay. What is the role of those advisors, like to stop the wrong decision?
So let's take one more and then we respond together. Let's go to اسمش ما چی بود آقای حیدری. Let's go to حیدری صاحب because his hand was raised whole time. A lot of hands. Oh, one over there.
Thank you so much, General. I've been teaching a class at Georgetown University on liberal estate building. Of course, we look at different places where United States then actually succeeded, and of course, pursuing positional grand strategies for success. Say, for example, post-World War II Europe and South Korea and Japan and others, from where, of course, you could have learned lessons to get Afghanistan right across four administrations, Republicans and Democrats. And now you've been arguing that I think you have had the right strategies, but I think the politics has always gotten in the way. You know, one of the lessons in disaster from Vietnam. So my question is whether I think in your role, this has been intentional, because I think some of the players, as I've served as ambassador to Sri Lanka and of course, deputy ambassador to India, and also worked with Ambassador Joa very closely, that some regional stakeholders has always viewed this, U.S. policy in Afghanistan as kind of a holding mission, a holding situation where U.S. has really not pursued a grand positional strategy for success. A, to pressure Pakistan to deliver. B, to pursue a peace strategy from day one, which President Karzai worked very hard as early as 2002 and 3. I think no one bought that here in the US. And C, state building, of course, to build state institutions, to invest as much of that,
Haidari Saib, thank you so much. We need to take some more questions.
Building A&E and A&P, of course, which Minister Spanto worked on, which never happened. And also, reviving and jump-starting the Afghan economy would focus on exploitation of natural resources and as well as infrastructure, so that all elements came together to help build the Afghan state and give us a South Korea that now is one of your key strategic allies in the Asia Pacific. And
Haidari Saib, we really need to take some more questions.
Or was
I
just,
see a lot of hands.
as you pointed out, politics versus strategy? Thank you.
Thank you.
For that,
Yes, but we take two more. I'm also a social justice person. So the next question, we take it from our American friends from that side. And I saw another, okay, and then we will come to you, okay?
Thank you, General, for your excellent commentary. One of the things I'm kind of frustrated by is this group thing in the intelligence community. I have a close friend who works with the agency who's been providing accurate intelligence to the NSC about what's going on with Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and so forth. And she's being punished as a result of this. Why do you think there's this sort of like groupthink? And the people who are trying to give people like you accurate information are being punished. And also, they've made it, I don't know if you're aware, but the Biden NSC issued a decree making it illegal for the CIA and other U.S. Government agencies to meet with anti-Taliban groups.
Thank you. I use my authority and take one more question from there. Okay, Mahdi Saib, go for it.
I just stand on
Yes, please. You are a guy.
for your speech, General. You talked about the delusion. I hope the delusion now, after Taliban taking back Kabul and doing what they are doing now, have been resolved. And they are the best, I think, speakers for themselves and spokespersons. So if the delusion is resolved in the Western countries, especially in the United States, what can we expect from the next American administration about Afghanistan? Thank you.
All right, General. So now
Yeah,
the
I'll try to be
floor.
I'll try to be quick. First of all, on the role of advisors, the role of advisors is to give the president, I think, best advice, best analysis, and multiple options so that in the comparison of those options, the president can see the long-term costs and consequences of each. In the book I just finished, I talk about that process with President Trump and how that process helped him come to a completely different course of action than he would have picked. And I think it's worth going back to the speech that he delivered in August of 2017. Please just take a minute and read that speech. I think, again, it was the first reasoned long-term approach to Afghanistan for the first time in that, by that time, a 16-year war. Sadly, he abandoned that. I was gone by that time. I don't know what was happening in terms of who was providing him with what advice at that stage. On state building, I think that there's shared responsibility, certainly, on the U.S. and the Afghan side. I don't think the 2002, 2003 peace initiative would have gotten anywhere anyway. But I think that, there were a lot of, short-term efforts that were initiated that we didn't follow up on in terms of state building. But I think what you're alluding to with all the question and the comments about, not exploiting the potential in the economy, everything else, I think every state building effort with which we've been engaged has been ugly to a certain extent. And certainly that was the case in South Korea. I think that's actually a very good example. There's a great book, I forget the author's name, called Nation Building in South Korea. I gave it to President Karzai when I had my monthly meetings with him, when I was commanding the task force. And one of the lessons that I think from that book was that it's always a very difficult path. Oftentimes, even in South Korea, U.S. agency policies were at counter purposes. It was kind of an ugly path. But also, we had to wait for the emergence of South Korean leadership that was really reform-minded. It was a very corrupt government under Syngman Rhee. They had a very desperate situation, if you remember, in South Korea at the time, right? The country had been ravaged by war. It was an illiterate population. The country had been completely destroyed, in terms of like not even a tree standing. And you had a hostile neighbor. But what emerged, it took a long time. I think the lesson of that book and the lesson of these experiences is it took a long time because there weren't political reforms in South Korea until the 1970s. Economic reforms, and then not political reforms until like the late 70s and early 80s. And so it takes time, I think, and we were too impatient on groupthink and where it comes from. I do think that you need people who can have a strong voice and counter the conventional wisdom. When I was in Iraq, when I was in Afghanistan in 2011 or 2012, 2010, 10, 11, I can't remember. An analyst who was in Iraq sent me basically an assessment of what would happen in Iraq after the withdrawal of U.S. forces. It was completely accurate. And I sent it to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who then sent it around the intel community. And that analyst got terrible blowback, because it basically predicted the rise of ISIS and what we saw happen in Iraq. It wasn't until maybe 8 or 10 years ago that a CIA report on what would happen in South Korea after the withdrawal of U.S. forces was declassified. This was a CIA report from, I think, November of 1949. Saying that after the withdrawal of the last U.S. troops in April of 1950, it would only be a matter of months before North Korea invaded South Korea. And of course, that's what happened. And so I think a lot of times we think that we're surprised, right, by so-called intel failures, because they're black swan events, right, unanticipated events with unanticipated consequences. But a lot of times in life, they're just pink flamingos. They're like right there in front of you. It's obvious to everybody, but people ignore the consequences. And then what to expect from the next administration? I think the American people these days have bought into, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the wars in Afghanistan, especially, but also Iraq, and our sustained commitments in both places. And there has been this kind of growth of this kind of this mantra of end the endless wars, right? And what people want to do is they want to end every war that they see, right? So you see, and I know this is controversial for me to say, that there are calls for, an immediate ceasefire in Gaza or vis-a-vis Hezbollah. But, from an Israeli perspective, there can't be any kind of an enduring peace unless you destroy an organization in Hamas in particular, who has in its charter the destruction of Israel and the killing of all the Jews. I think you see the same kind of call for a ceasefire in Ukraine. That there should just be a ceasefire, but I think there's a failure to recognize that you can't have an acceptable peace or a negotiated agreement. It gets to the question about diplomacy that is inconsistent with the military realities. Remember what we heard people say for many years, oh, hey, there's no military solution in Afghanistan. Well, the Taliban came up with one, didn't they? And so I think that we forget oftentimes what the English theologian G.K. Chesterton said, which is war is not the best way of settling differences, but it's the only way to ensure they're not settled for you. And so I think in what you can expect from Americans, I think you would see deep reluctance these days for any kind of direct military action, certainly, because of this idea that we are unable to use force in a way that can achieve an acceptable outcome at an acceptable cost and risk. And I think a lot of that has to do with the inconsistent and fundamentally flawed strategies that we applied in Afghanistan and Iraq over many years. So it's going to take Americans a while to get over it. But again, I think what was said already, the Taliban are their best spokesman. Look at them. If there's any hope, for the international community rallying again, it will be because of the Taliban's behavior. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you and all the tremendous questions, and thanks for the opportunity. And thanks for
General McMaster, thank you so very much for the insight you shared.